Hello. It's time for another Gita video. This time, we're looking at chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. It says, "For the beginner at yoga, practicing a discipline is said to be the means. For one who has attained at yoga, the cessation of all such activities is said to be the means." When one does not involve himself in the senses or in activities, renouncing all desires, at that time one is said to have reached the height of yoga. In our previous video, it said that whoever it is that engages in what must be done is a true renunciate. And there it said, what they call renunciation, you must know as uniting, which is another way of saying as yoga. And so this is about the issue of uniting. But let's look at these verses from those two levels, the definition of yoga as a spiritual practice and the definition of yoga as uniting to the divine. In the context of yoga as a spiritual practice, verse 3 says that practicing in discipline is said to be the means for a beginner. For he who has attained the cessation of all such activity is said to be the means. This is a very important statement because people will often forget that spiritual practice is a progressive discipline. It builds off of each progressive step, each previous step. And effectively what that means is that you have practices at the beginning that are going to be more complex and more structured. And then practices at the higher end will actually look more simple than those. And people will sometimes make the mistake of trying to go straight to those simpler practices, to think, well, the complex practices aren't important. All that you need to do is watch your breath. All that you need to do is sit in a lotus posture, or something like that. And they're doing this in part because they don't have an effective spiritual curriculum, or they don't have a teacher that is competent and capable of explaining to them why there are these steps that are necessary. Your mind has a great deal of distractions that make attainment more difficult, and that make the ability to understand what it is that you are attaining more difficult. And you'll see in the next video on this subject, when we look at line 5, it starts talking about the need to separate the soul from the mind so as not to be clouded. So the beginner needs to have first practices that are meant to untangle the connection between mind, body, and soul, to put things into a certain order. And that's necessary before higher level practices are useful. People have asked me what I think of stuff like vipassana or mindfulness retreats or seminars or trainings or things like that, or the repetition of mantras, or other such exercises that are these seemingly very supposed to be these one-size-fits-all, fixes everything sort of exercises. And I say that for 99.9% of people who try them, they're going to be useless, like literally useless. They might have some short-term effect in potentially relaxing you or something like that. But if you're talking about for the purposes of enlightenment, they are largely going to be ineffectual. They're not going to be harmful necessarily, although even there is a possibility. There's a chance, for example, that the constant attentiveness of mindfulness training, which is supposed to be a training that you go through after you go through other practices, is, for somebody who isn't in a good state of balance, can actually be very counterproductive. It can end up harming them. It can end up making you more stressed out over time rather than less stressed out, and it could end up making you feel more anxious and unmoored and all sorts of things that are not really going to be helpful, and that you can get lost in this mental contemplation that really just goes round and round in circles and gets nowhere. So you have to know where to begin. The place to begin is really in focusing into the body. And there are lots of ways to do this. So like there are a great many different kinds of Indian yogas that start in this way, right? Whether it be, for example, with the practice of holding asanas, which is to put yourself into a certain posture and remain deeply rooted in that posture. And you'll see similar things in East Asian traditions with the basic exercise of Qigong, right? The first thing that you usually have to do to get out of your head is to get into your body. And this is an essential part of what you have to accomplish. So that's what it's saying here in the sense of the activity, is the person who becomes more of an adept in spiritual practice will end up finding other exercises that they have to that they have to engage in that are going to look in many ways simpler than the ones that they were doing when they began. But this is because you have now been prepared for it by doing the more complex exercises that you were doing before. On the other hand, if you have a look at this through the perspective of yoga as spiritual union, at the beginning, what it says, you have to practice a discipline of spiritual union. So at first you are seeking to obtain the experience of spiritual union. You're not engaged in that experience yet, but you're trying to do these disciplines in order to have that experience of spiritual union. That is the first step. When you become more adept, then the key is going to be able to let go of yourself enough to obtain that spiritual union without having to take the intermediary steps. There's one of the hexagrams of the Ching that talks about how somebody having mastered the forms can now proceed without having to engage in the technical aspects of ritual in order to invoke heaven. And this is a similar sort of context as what's being said here. When one does not involve himself in the senses or in activities, renouncing desires, at that time one is said to have reached the height of yoga. So at the beginning, yoga involves getting really disciplined into a set of exercises and a set of practices. You have to really engage with it, just like with Qigong, just like with magic, just like with any sort of spiritual exercise, where you have to develop a discipline and a routine and a structure that is going to remake you, that is going to alter your being physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, to prepare yourself to be a vessel for this divine union. And then after that, your exercise, your challenge is going to be able to go through this process of undoing yourself as you are to become what you can be. And this is described in many different ways. And in the Western tradition, it's sometimes been referred to as the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. In some Indian traditions, the renunciation of the ego, right? And in Qigong, it's about shifting association from the inferior person to the superior individual. So all of this means that the work of the initiate, of the beginner in spiritual practice, is to really dedicate themselves into a serious routine of work and to put all of themselves into that work. The work of an advanced student is to undo themselves. And then the last part of that even includes, as the Gita talks about, the undoing of one's attachments to the ideas of of all desires, and that includes the desire for your idea of what spiritual union is like, your concept of what enlightenment or God or any of these things are like, because that's the big barrier that's in the way at the end of the day of what that experience is going to be like. You're trying to create the experience. As a beginner, you have to create certain experiences so you can go through this alchemical kind of process. As an adept, you have to learn not to be the one in command of creating your experiences. That's everything for today. I hope you liked this video. Check out the other videos in the Bhagavad Gita series, and check out the other playlists in this channel. I'd especially recommend the Yifa Society playlist. And if you're interested in a course of spiritual training, of a focused set of progressive spiritual disciplines for long-term self-transformation, then look into the Yifa Society and get in touch with me if you're interested in learning that. Also, check out the link in the description for our newsletter. The newsletter is free, and it's sent out roughly once a month and has a series of teachings and quotes in it, most of them from stuff I've been working on across the different social media, but sometimes original content. And if you join up in the newsletter, in the introductory email that you get, there will be a link there to where you can download a free PDF of The Path of the Power, which is my interpretation and commentary on the Tao Te Ching, which is a great complement to either the Gita or the Ching. So be sure to check that out. Thank you very much.